Hello, our truth warriors, and welcome back to the Atlantic Underground. I must apologize that we haven't been putting anything out lately, but in the background, we have been extremely busy. We've been building a new website. We've been building a lot of healing and wellness products that you're going to start seeing becoming available, especially at times where a lot of healing and wellness products are being taken off the shelves and demonized, especially in Canada by the Canadian government. So we're going to try and counteract that and bring the very supplies and systems that you're going to need, and look forward to bringing all that to you with the new website and the new design of things in 2025. Now, today's guest is a speaker, a writer, a strategist who is focused on a paradigm shifting question, which is, do you know who you are? Which many don't, unfortunately. Where you stand, and also how to hold that at the same time. She seeks to break down the very system that has been holding us at the mercy of an agenda-driven regime. She understands the true meaning and wording in the contracts, which is set to further enslave us. Her goal is to protect those who are in danger and bring about change to the world we live in, safeguarding the children who have become so vulnerable to an insane change in policies and also an ideology pushing in the wrong direction. Welcome to the Atlantic Underground. Nicole Connor, how are you?
I'm well, Chris. Thank you so much for having me
No,
today for this conversation.
no, it's fantastic. Now, is it true you are the sister of Sarah Connor and together you battle transhumanism?
I mean, I wish, but I mean, maybe in another timeline, in another lifetime, I was, but or who knows? But
Maybe
not at this time.
yeah, maybe the name Connor, like the clan, the Connor clan, and the battle hardiness of those that have had that name throughout history have
It's
now
true. It
landed.
might be.
Now, it's probably landed in your lap now to pick the baton up and run with it once more. So that's
It's
good.
true. It's like that warrior spirit. It's somewhere.
Yeah. Now, I do want to say before we start, now, the topic obviously that we're going to get into today, and I do want to say I have no problem with freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of choice, and the rights of those that have what I consider to be sexual perversions, in most cases, mental illnesses. We now live in a society that not only wants to promote this as being healthy, but also push it into the minds of young, influential boys and girls. And I'm sorry if this offends you, but I make no apologies for being a heterosexual male with a natural moral compass and a willingness to be a real man and a protector in this world. I do have a problem with paedophiles, which people have known before, or as they have so aptly named themselves now, minor attractive persons. And it is my opinion that it would be in society's favour to euthanize them in the same way that we do with any other incurable animal out there. Now, Nicole has seen the manipulation of school policies to allow such demonic perverts to have access to your children while you work hard and actually are out there trying to pay the taxes to those who govern you. This is not something any loving parent should be turning a blind eye to. And it has to start by challenging the very educational system out there that is doing this to the children. This is a global lockstep problem right now, as drag queens and those hell bent on cutting body parts off young children under the guise of transgender reassignment infiltrate the schools around us. Laws are put into place so we can't criticize them, but I am actually past giving a shit about the feelings of those sick, twisted perverts, and I am prepared to continue to speak out until something changes. So, here today is a perfect example of how the satanic sexual plans are being put into place. Nicole is very brave to come forward and speak about this. So, Nicole, before we get into the policy that we're going to discuss today, tell me what you personally think about the infiltration of the young, innocent minds of children in the school system today.
Oh my goodness. As it's interesting. So in order to look at kind of where we at it where we're at, I'm also looking at where we've come from. And as an elder millennial, if you will, um, throughout the 90s, we saw like the ramp up of the hypersexualization of children. And that was my experience in the school system, was the
Yeah.
onslaught of this really starting to come into form. And so having experienced it and knowing how I felt during that time and not really being able to reconcile my own internal feelings with the authority of the adults outside of me. When I stand back now, and we didn't have as many ideologies and constructed belief systems imposed on us at that time as is happening right now. And again, I'm not here to pass judgment on, how do I say this? I'm not here to pass judgment necessarily on, as an adult, how you want to live your life, so long as it's not to the detriment or harm of another person.
Yeah.
But when we are talking about children, we are getting into very, very dangerous territory when we allow them to remain vulnerable with adults that ought to know better, but aren't acting better. And whether it's because they're following the rules, they're following a policy, it's their own belief system.
Yeah.
Um, we're no longer, and haven't been for a really long time. I mean, the public school system has been constructed for a very specific reason. But
Yeah.
we are at a point now where we are so outside of an education model and only operating inside of an ideological belief structure that there is no education happening anymore. Kids are not learning functional uh, tools and obtaining the knowledge that they need to actually operate in the world.
Yeah.
Um, and by design, we have AI coming in, which is probably going to fill that gap, that
Yeah.
education gap. But yeah,
Are you seeing a lot of change in Canada with people and children thinking that this is a new normal and
yes.
are just accepting it that this is the way that life is?
Absolutely. And I think now would also be a great time. I should probably preface this conversation by saying I don't have kids and I'm not actively involved in the school system day to day, but I am a member of a community and I am surrounded by children. And I
Yeah.
do understand that just as I was the children that will be making decisions on behalf of the boomers and determining how they live out the rest of their years, so
Yeah.
were these kids. And I have a deep moral and ethical obligation to, if I see something, I'm going to say something, whether someone wants to hear that or not. And that was something that became very prevalent during the pandemic, where I went from thinking I didn't have a maternal bone in my body to going, not on my watch is this going to happen to those kids.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. And I wish more people would actually just find it in them to stand up. Now, we interviewed Dr. Jim Meehan and we did several interviews with him. And he's unfortunately, sadly, no longer with us to continue his work. But we discussed the reason for this explosion of confused and misguided children. And it appears to stem from hormone disruption, chemicals in water, food, and pharmaceuticals that have lowered the levels of the likes of the testosterone in boys, and it's been replaced with high levels of BPA or estrogen mimickers. And the girls are having the same problem, seeing imbalances through chemical compositions. Now, this could easily be cleaned up and cured, but those pushing and promoting this new normal that we've spoken about have the monopoly on food and pharmaceutical and control the water supply and things like that. Is it time for people to take a stand and change the future right now?
It is, but for me, taking a stand is a very individual process, right? We have to determine what we're seeing outside of ourselves collectively is just a reflection of our internal world. And we have to work on changing the internal world to see the reflections on the outside, but using what we're seeing on the outside as the guideposts to figure out what changes we need to make on the inside.
Yeah.
And it becomes this very symbiotic process where we have to start learning, well, not even learning, remembering who we are so that we can begin to work through our own kind of dishonesty and denial and betrayals and deceptions to be able to get to the point that we can build the trust within that allows us to secure it outside of ourselves with those who are worthy of that trust.
Yeah, yeah. A friend of ours and a guest on the podcast, David Icke, he has not only written a book called Remember Who You Are, which was very pertinent again for people waking up and realizing what they were, who they should be, rather than what we're told to be in this day and age. But I always remember within conversations with David that he would always turn around and say, I don't care what people do in the bedroom. That's none of my business. You want to do
Right.
something behind closed doors, have at it, But, and he always has maintained the one thing for many, many years now. Do not push it in my face, and don't tell me that I have to think it's right and follow the same way that you are. And we're seeing that unfortunately in the world around us today. Now, what we want to focus on as well today is the main thing of the conversation. You were alerted to something within paperwork, but first of all, can you tell us about the Oyster Pond Academy, where it's located, and what has happened within that institution of education?
Sure. So this happened to be a news article at first that I just stumbled upon. And the news article was alluding to an issue that happened. So Oyster Pond Academy is on the eastern shore of Nova Scotia. And a guest speaker was brought into the school to speak on gender identity, essentially. And what transpired and what I've been told through the parents that I've interacted with during that time, what's been relayed to me is that they brought in a guest speaker to speak on gender identity. It happened to be also a working drag queen. I don't believe he was in his drag attire at that time,
Yeah.
but it was someone that the school administrators, I think, had been in contact with at a previous event and decided to bring him into the school to have this conversation. And there were children that were in this space who were very uncomfortable with the topics that were being discussed. And some of them had been asking to leave, and they were told by the administrators, no, you're not allowed. So they were not allowed to leave the room. The parents didn't know that this particular event was taking place. And then there were other kids who were very uncomfortable, wanted to leave, but because no one else was leaving or allowed to leave, they chose to sit there. Now, the parents found out later on what was happening because the person who came in to speak also shared his social media with the students, which was 18 and above content. It was very sexually explicit content that was now being promoted to these children. And from what I understand, the age range around this event was like 11 to 14. So we're dealing with young children, minors. And when the parents started to speak out, and there were only two that were brave enough to go on the news, they were met with some backlash by the administration, and it was the response from HRCE, which is the amalgamated school board that we have here, and this written response from the administration, from the principal and vice principal, that made me go, "What the heck did they do? They know what they just said?" And the moment I started reading all of this, I do what I do best, which is I go right to the contracts, which in this particular case would be the Education Act.
Yeah.
And the only thing in the Education Act that really indicates um, what can happen policy wise is that there has to be a policy code of conduct.
Yeah.
And I'll get into that a little bit later. But um, the moment I saw this article, I'm like, oh, no, no, no. So I started reaching out to parents. And what I've found is that the parents who did speak out have had absolute social repercussions from what's happened.
Yeah.
Many of them who are not happy about what happened won't speak out because we have this cancel culture. So now you're a parent, you're going to speak out. Maybe you put your face on the news, maybe you don't. You lose your community connections. You're concerned about retaliation in the schools on your children and from other children and community members. Uh, if you get too public, you could potentially lose your job because so many businesses have adopted DEI policies, not understanding that policies can't inherently break a law and they're incompatible. essentially is what's happening, is all of these policies that are coming out are actually incompatible with the laws. And if we don't know what those laws are, then we're always going to be at a perpetual disadvantage. And if we spend all of our time only consuming what they want us to look at and how they want to frame it, then we're not actually looking at the black on white, unemotional legislation and acts where the real power can actually move in our favor to be able to tackle big issues like this without ever once getting into the beliefs and ideologies.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, what has been hidden in the provincial school code of conduct policy, and why should parents pay close attention to the wording of this?
So shortly after I spoke with one of the parents, they forwarded me an email that went out by HRCE on behalf of the Department of Education. And what they're doing is proposing amendments to the current policy code of conduct. Now, the policy code of conduct, the intention of that is to be able to define and add context to what they call unacceptable behavior. And all of those unacceptable behaviors are very clearly outlined and listed inside of the Education Act. So when I look at those unacceptable behaviors in the Education Act, because there's no language in the act that allows me to believe that any of these terms are negotiable. So what it says in the Education Act is that unacceptable behavior means behavior that endangers the well-being of others, damages property, or significantly disrupts the learning of others, and includes, not may include, and includes, and it gives an exhaustive list. So when I looked at the original policy code of conduct, my initial reaction to what was taking place at Oyster Pond Academy in the context of that conversation where the children were not allowed to leave is, well, from a code of conduct and disciplinary standpoint, this actually fits their written definition of sexual harassment. And sexual harassment, per the current code of conduct, is any objectionable, coercive, or irritating comment, communication, action, or attention of a sexual nature that is directed to a person or persons by someone who knows or ought to reasonably know that such actions are unwelcome. Actions or communications with a sexual connotation or component that creates an intimidating, demeaning, or offensive work or school environment, even if it's directed at no person in particular. That's a pretty damning definition that when you look at on its face what happened in Oyster Pond, kind of fits the bill.
Yeah,
So, right? It's all there. And when it comes to kind of the hypersexualization of children, if you will, or in this code of conduct, they have sexual assault, sexual harassment, and sexual misconduct listed as three separate definitions. Sexual assault is in line with the Criminal Code of Canada. They actually have it noted there. Sexual misconduct, incredibly vague definition, which says sexual misconduct includes any behavior of a sexual nature or connotation that is deemed inappropriate or unacceptable at school or during any school-related activity. Now, I think it's important to note that in its current form, and I'm reading from the current code of conduct, the current code of conduct applies to all public schools and school boards in the province of Nova Scotia. All students and school members in Nova Scotia are required to follow this provincial code of conduct policy, which is governed by the Education Act. It's written right there. They have school members defined as all adults whose roles or jobs place them in contact with students in school settings and school activities. School members include students, principals, teachers, parents, staff employed by the school board, other staff engaged to provide services at the school, volunteers, visitors, and any person to have contact with students and staff. It's very clear.
yeah,
So when I was forwarded this feedback form, so essentially the Department of Education has decided to revise this policy code of conduct. Apparently, there's a lot of holes in it. There's some issues. And they have put together a consultation, a group to do consultation, and it includes school advisory councils, Public School Administrators Association, the Nova Scotia Teachers Union to put all of this together. Now, in their proposed changes, the deception and first, the deception is absolutely off the charts because all they're doing is picking and choosing and cherry picking what they want you to look at. So in one section, they explicitly say, well, the code of conduct traditionally only applies to students. Should we make it also applicable to adults such as parents, community, and staff. It already is.
Hmm.
Why are we telling people that that doesn't exist? It already exists.
Yeah.
The most concerning section is that they have completely removed any definition for sexual abuse and sexual harassment. So they've left sexual misconduct in its incredible ambiguity,
Yeah.
but they've removed these two incredibly important definitions, which still, for all intents and purposes, exist in the Education Act.
Hmm.
So why are they doing that?
Yeah.
Well, it's because those definitions are 100% incompatible with the administration of the inclusive education policy. And the inclusive education policy is what administrators are openly saying they are bound to implement and administrate. But the administration, as we saw in Oyster Pond Academy, violates the definition of sexual harassment. So at what point do we ignore that there's a hierarchy to policy? At what point do we ignore that there's a contract that everyone is bound to? At what point do we stop ignoring the fact that this is an uninsurable risk that the administrators are taking on when they're breaking acts and laws to uphold a policy? And who's going to pay for the damages? Because
Exactly.
there are damages.
Yeah.
And there's an entire school insurance program where kids are actually, every student in this province is insured and what for harms that can happen in the school. And part of that is psychological counseling. So, can we start claiming damages through these insurance policies? And is the insurer even required to pay out those premiums and those deductibles and the actual damages
Yeah.
if they're violating the act and the policy?
It makes me wonder as well whether the insurance companies would actually even be aware of the wording and the lettering of these policies, which are school board policies, the educational system itself. But when they agree to insure these schools, it makes me wonder whether the insurance companies are actually aware of this, because I guarantee there would be some kind of clause within the contract that would not allow them to do such things and literally put themselves at such risk of having a claim against them, should a parent or child or even somebody within the community that wasn't happy with what they were doing and decided to go against the school board or the school itself. You'd probably find that the insurance company would push back at this point and say, this is upon yourselves. This is not something we agree to cover under our terms and agreements. So, yeah, it makes you wonder whether they are putting in what they're actually doing, that they are putting themselves at great risk. I worked in insurance for over 12 years,
So you
and
understand it.
I do understand it, yeah, and I guarantee that should the insurance companies that cover the school boards were made aware of these policies, that those policies would probably be voided, and they would literally turn around and say, we cannot underwrite a policy for this, or should they choose to underwrite such a policy, it would just not be cost effective for the school to be able to continue with these policies, because at the end of the day, the risk would become so great that the premium the insurance would put on the schools and the school board would be just ridiculous in price, and that would have to certainly be addressed by those in the administration that handle the funding and the costs to run these schools. The schools are already struggling for money anyway to bring, things, books and materials for children for education anyway. The moment that the school board would probably understand how much of a risk they are presenting in what they're doing in terms of a claim against them and the cost of such an insurable policy, it would just make it just undoable. And yeah, maybe if the parents would possibly take a look at that and start pushing the boundaries on that, maybe they don't have to push back too hard against what they're not agreeing with, which I would still recommend they do, because there certainly should be a moral compass in people to do so. But at the end of the day, It's like when they went after Al Capone, they certainly couldn't get him on many other things that he did, but maybe a bit of tax evasion. So there's always an
Yeah,
Achilles heel. There's always the Achilles heel where people can go after him.
absolutely. And I do think of like an administrative approach and why I tend to take an administrative approach. And when I say that, it's I'm looking at the act, I'm looking at the policies, I'm looking for incongruencies, and I'm looking where there's violations of the contract. And the reason I'm doing that is because it undercuts any belief or ideology that someone may have.
Yeah,
Because at the end of the day, if you're having a sexually charged conversation in a room with children and you're not allowing them to leave, and your policy defines that as sexual harassment, I don't care what other policies you have, because the Education Act says that you are not allowed to commit sexual harassment. And I mean, I can go down another rabbit hole about what acts actually are and um, that entire structure. But at the same time, we still have to live in this world. So it's kind of like, how do you learn how to administrate yourself appropriately in these spaces and kind of stay out of the political minutia of everything? Because what I found really interesting with with this particular response from the OPA administrators, is that they were very emotional in their response, which we would expect. But it was very damning what they actually admitted to in that space, and then what they were perpetrating, and even the information that they pushed out was somewhat incorrect.
yeah,
And they what really struck a chord at me, and this is where we see, and I think what really put the fire in my belly, is because we saw like this public shaming happen, as a way of deterring parents from speaking out, um, because they're basically saying, if we don't teach this, your children are going to become a harm to society, and they're going to be and they're going to harm others due to racism, homophobia, transphobia. Like, we need to protect society from actually carrying this out. And the school needs to be an inclusive place where all students feel safe and respected and welcomed, unless these conversations make you uncomfortable. I believe one of the parents told me, like, when one of the kids had asked to leave, they were told to get uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. So when you have a child who is saying this sexual conversation is not okay with me, and everything in their body is telling them get out of that space, and the adults are saying no,
yeah,
that is a much bigger problem. That is a much bigger problem, that we are telling our kids to ignore every impulse and instinct and intuitive nudge that they have,
yeah.
um, to be defiled like that.
I think what amazes me, I mean, like when we think of doctors and nurses that will take an oath to do no harm and protect the patients that they work with, surely there must be something in place in a similar thing that they sign that the teachers also should be there for the protection of the children in the schools. Are you hearing anything off teachers? Have any teachers contacted you to say, yeah, I don't agree with this. This is not what I want to do? Or just in society in general, I know the cost of living's gone through the roof. Are people so fearful of losing the job and their income and everything that they've trained for that they're prepared to go along with this absolute insanity just to maintain a paycheck?
I think that's exactly what's happening. And there are people that they don't agree with it, but they don't know what to do. And when push comes to shove, they don't want to actually put their name on anything or their face on anything. And this has been my struggle for quite a few years, like having gone through the pandemic and being very outspoken during that time, and having my face all over the place during that time.
Yeah,
I've kind of built up uh I've built up my resilience to that, and I've really learned how to kind of stand in my neutrality, to be able to navigate situations like that. But when you're emotionally charged, you're going to go into fight or flight, and you're going to make decisions based on that.
yeah,
And that's why the school issue is so interesting to me, because they were seeking feedback. So when they were looking at the policy, they were seeking feedback from community, not just parents, but parents, teachers, community members, bus drivers, because everyone has a say in the public school system. And this is where I have to stand back and go, okay, well, as someone who doesn't have any children, um, I kind of have a duty and an obligation to say something, because it starts to create guardrails and a zone of safety
Mhm.
for the parents to be able to slowly start to find their voice and speak out, and not do it alone. Like I've been that squeaky wheel. I've been that person who's standing there alone going, guys, where is everybody
Yeah.
at? This would be so much easier if I even had just three people standing with me. And I think that's what's really important to kind of push through with the idea of looking at things administratively and looking at the contracts is far fewer people are required to move the needle when you're dealing with something at an administrative level than if you were just creating noise and going to HR, customer service and complaints, which would be the Human Rights Commission, the MLAs, every other gatekeeper that's been set up around these contracts. If you're going in those spaces, it's going to be emotional. It's going to be a word salad. No one's going to point you in the right direction. But if you can go straight to these contracts and know who it is that you need to speak to, you can push buttons really quickly and you can actually get traction very, very fast and push this change forward.
Yeah.
And it's not as scary as you think it's going to be because you're not actually when we get emotional, that's when we tend to break laws. That's when we tend to put ourselves in situations where we're breaking laws because there's booby traps set up everywhere that they're waiting for you to get emotional so that you misstep and then it's like, oh well, you broke this law trying to make this point and now you're out of luck, sorry.
Yeah.
And you start to
Or,
lose your credibility.
or they'll hit you with disturbing the peace or causing civil unrest. The most ridiculous things that, I've seen so many times over the years of people being arrested and yeah, just basically, causing public nuisance. That they've got these laws that they seem to pull out of a hat, and they'll
Mm-hmm.
use the most ridiculous things to say, well, you're doing this, where what they're not actually looking at is the rights that people have, certainly under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I mean, we've had Brian Peckford on, and we've interviewed Brian Peckford, the last remaining man that penned that charter itself. And, people are not actually understanding the laws that are being used against them. There are also laws that they have to protect themselves when expressing freedom of speech, when being able to speak in public. And nobody is utilizing these very powerful laws that are there to protect them. And I think that, many parents out there who are scared to speak out because they think they're going to get into trouble, if they just went away and did a little bit of research and educated themselves, even form a local group, you don't have to just immediately get up off the sofa and turn the hockey off and go out and start shouting at teachers and people at the school to make an impact. People have the strength, the like-minded people that do not like what's going on here. Get together with some parents, have a nice wine and cheese evening, meet up at the local Tim Hortons, whatever you want to do, but get together and discuss this. And believe me, when the numbers come in solidarity, together you will have the power, the strength, the knowledge, and the ability to defeat the very thing that is changing the mindset and the mental capacity of the children within these schools. And I really think there is ways around this legally, morally, and certainly justifiably that people should move forward and do. Get together, form a community. If you don't agree with what's going on in the schools, stand together, but stand in truth and make sure what you're doing cannot be challenged by the very system. And as you've said, a few minutes ago there, we discussed there are legal options. There are things with insurable contracts and things that go on in these schools. Go for the Achilles heel. Don't just stand there and shout at people, which I understand that people will be upset and angry about what's going on, but play their game. If they're going to play a game, go in and beat them at the very game they're playing and go in and attack that Achilles heel. And I'm sure you agree with me that this is certainly a very good way of stopping this progressing any further.
100%. And I have direct experience myself advocating for myself and others through these administrative processes. You don't even have to go into a court. That's like the most beautiful thing about these processes is because at the end of the day, and whether you had mentioned earlier about the teachers having oaths, and I'm not 100% sure if they're required through the Commissioner of Oath as a public service employee to take an oath specifically or not, but through their employment contracts. See, this is where following the contracts is so important. They have an employment contract, they have a union contract. Those entities are somehow bound and in contract with the Department of Education. So we're just going to follow that thread of contracts that will always lead you back to the Department of Education,
Yeah.
which is going to put this on the doorstep of the minister. Now the minister, that's going to come and go with every election cycle, but it's a good thing they have a deputy that never seems to move,
Yeah.
right? So it's really starting to understand these like the ABCDs of the province of Nova Scotia, which is the corporation, not the landmass. Like we just had an election here yesterday. And I've been talking about this a lot lately, where it's like legislature, we're just going to push that right out of the way, because as far as I'm concerned, that's the smoke and mirrors that keeps everything highly confused. And we're going to focus squarely on the executive council, which is where the premier sits as president, where the lieutenant governor sits as CEO, and where every minister who has an appointment, whether they are elected or not, is responsible for a portfolio. They are responsible for the agency boards, commissions, and departments that are all in contract with the province of Nova Scotia. And at the end of the day, they do have an oath, and under agent to principal, principal to agent, everyone that falls under their purview, their actions are their actions, and their actions are the king's actions. So we're going to look at this through the crown, and we're going to look at who ultimately is responsible, who's liable. And so when we can get into the departments, there's a beautiful office in Nova Scotia. Every province has one, and it's called the Office of the Ombudsman. And the purpose of the Office of the Ombudsman is to make sure that the departments are doing what they're supposed to do. So a lot of people will go to the Ombudsman if they're not getting responses. Like, you can go to the Ombudsman to compel a response from an MLA or from a various department. But you can also, if you're savvy enough, get them to adjudicate the contracts and say, like, here's the issue that we're having. This is the apparent contract violation. This is the information that I have. There's a problem, and I need you to come back with a decision on it. And
Yeah.
it becomes an incredibly powerful mechanism. And you don't even have to necessarily get to that point. Because sometimes if you're communicating in writing, and always in writing, always in writing, because every time you communicate with a government department, as I'm sure you know, it becomes a public document.
Yeah.
So these become FOIA requests, and you can now start doing FOIA requests and pulling all of the adjoining documents or anything that could be pertinent to what you're talking about. You're now using their words, their language, their correspondence as further evidence to support your claim. So something I'm in the process of doing right now with OPA is seeing if I can get my hands on the emails that were sent to secure the guest speaker in the first place.
Yeah. And we know,
Right? That
yeah, we know just the very person that might be able to help you with freedom of information requests in Nova Scotia as well. And I'll send him a copy of this interview and
Right.
see.
Because I know there's people, and that's why I like having these conversations, because it's like, I don't have enough time to do it all myself. But like, again, like, it takes a village. So everyone has their strength. Everyone has something that they're really good at and passionate at doing. Like, let's put our heads together. Like, the whole reason the system exists is because we're all cogs in the wheel, and
Yeah.
everyone is completely siloed. But if we come together, we have so much information. And a lot of the information that I gather when I'm doing my fact finding is from frontline employees. Like, receptionists will tell you so much. I've learned so much about the executive council and the lieutenant governor's office from the lovely lady who sits on the desk of the executive council office.
Yeah.
Things that I probably shouldn't know, but they wouldn't know why you're asking the questions that you're asking, and they will disclose information that maybe you shouldn't know.
Yeah.
So it just, when we can take these administrative processes and really learn, like, the power of the pen, your word, your pen is your sword. Like, it's so powerful. And we have to get out of the question, out of the Canadian mentality and mindset that Canadians are nice is awful. But we don't ask questions, and we're not asking permission. We're making statements, and because everything is a rebuttable assumption. Like, we read these letters and we're like, oh, it must be true. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
no, I'm now going to challenge what you've said, because you haven't given me any context. You've not given me any definitions. And if I assume incorrectly, well, now I'm sunk. But the moment that I come back to you and say, well, this is what I understood, you now have to come back and say, yes, you're right, or no, you're wrong. Or
Yeah,
you don't respond at all, which no response is a response, and it's usually a yes. So that's why it becomes really powerful to have these back and forths in writing, because people will trip up. They're human.
that's it.
Um, and these policies, when you start going back and forth, are indefensible.
Yeah,
They're indefensible against the contents of the contracts, which is why the removal of the definitions of sexual harassment and sexual abuse are so important, because now they get left up to assumption and presumption. If it goes to the courts, it gets left to precedent. Those there's no one, there's no reason to remove them because they exist in the Education Act. Two, we're talking about children. There's no reason to not have those defined. Three, principals, teachers, this applies to you too. Why would you want to remove that for your own personal safety? Like, the math ain't mathing. Like, none of this makes sense because everybody is just taking it at face value and going, oh, inclusive education policy, got to follow that, have to be a good human, don't want
yeah.
to be racist, transphobic, or homophobic.
No, no, and a lot of people don't realize, and well, myself personally, for many years, I've looked into different laws. We've had people on the show who are very well versed in laws. And a lot of the time, these policies that are written are not vetted to the level that they should be for legal competence. But also you find that a lot of people will receive something on an official letterhead. There will be certain words in bold. There will be certain things that make it sound scary. And a lot of people will comply to these letters because it looks so official. It looks like they're in serious trouble, or that this letter is so important that it shouldn't be ignored. And when people actually start to break down the little tricks and tactics that are used in putting these things together, the whole power that piece of paper holds actually starts to fall away. And when you're picking at the stitching that holds it together, and it just falls apart. And it's really empowering when people realize that those that are putting these things forward in policies, in letters, in legislations, they're not always right. And I would say probably the majority of the time they're not right, but nobody ever goes in and starts to pull it apart and say, this is why it's not right and it's illegal in what it's doing. All they have is an agenda to follow, a goal to meet. And these are just the stepping stones towards that. And should the public, the parents, whoever, ignore the actual inner wording of these things, then that is, shame on them because they're allowing it to happen without actually challenging the very system. And this is what I'd like to see more people doing. Educate yourselves, inform yourselves, empower yourselves against this, and challenge the very system and explain to them why it's wrong, why it's unlawful, and what they're doing, and demand that this is put right and correct. And I think a lot of changes that we would see moving forward would be from people empowering themselves and actually pushing back against these policies.
At the very root of it, these policies are nothing but massive liabilities. So again, when we get into that conversation of like, well, who's going to pay for this?
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for these damages? Um, the Department of Education isn't going to take that on. They're going to push it down to the teacher, just like the government wasn't going to take it on for the business owners during the pandemic. So it becomes, and this is like the trust issue, right? This is where we start really having to learn how to trust ourselves and trust those intuitive nudges, and trust that we are intelligent enough to find this information. It's interesting because when you get to the construct of everything, it's actually quite small and there's really not that many moving parts. And when you can really understand, like we started this off by saying, like, do you know who you are, where you stand, and how you hold it? For me, that is capacity. Who are you? Jurisdiction, where are you standing? And contracts. Those
Yeah.
three things are so powerful. So capacity, it can be your title. It can be the title that you have at a job. It can be mom, dad, brother, sister, friend, all different capacities. Then you
Yeah.
have the jurisdiction. Are you standing in your house? Are you in the school? Are you, in your right state of mind? It's a piece of paper is a jurisdiction.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
contracts are everything that bind those three things together. And the
yeah,
moment you can look at something and see those three elements, you've already started to win, and win in the sense that all you're doing is pulling, and this is a word that's been bastardized, but all you're doing is trying to find the equity in the contract, which
yeah,
means we're coming to a mutual understanding of what this is and what this isn't. So, something I've been coaching some of the parents on at Oyster Pond is the first question is, why wasn't this adjudicated through the policy code of conduct? So I'm demanding an investigation through your current policy code of conduct to ensure that these bullying, discrimination, and sexual harassment has not been committed, which is really hard to deny when you read this letter that's been posted online from the administrators. And what are you going to do about it? Because it appears that we have incompatible policies.
yeah,
So what are you going to do about it? And yes, they're trying to push these proposed changes through, but this one's still in effect. So how do we utilize it to the best of its ability? And we're already seeing in very short order how the inclusive education policy can be applied and blow up in two completely different ways. So at OPA, Oyster Pond, it had to do with this guest speaker. At a school in Sackville, it had to do when a principal told war veterans not to wear their uniform to a Remembrance Day ceremony.
yeah. So that,
Same policy. That's the application of the same policy. Public outrage, completely different because of the beliefs and ideologies underneath of it. Has nothing to do with that. Everything to do with the contracts.
yeah. And it makes me wonder as well. I mean, every teacher and every employee in a school working with children has to have police checks done and make
Mhm.
sure that they have no records or nothing that would tarnish or stop them from actually working with either vulnerable people or with children within schools. Has any parents or have anybody in any of the regions, anywhere throughout Canada now, actually challenged the school where the drag queens and these people are coming into the school? Has anybody actually asked for the paperwork to prove that these people coming in to talk about sexual preferences and things like that are actually legally allowed to come into the school and sit and talk to children based upon any past records that they may have, whether it be of a sexual nature or a crime in that regards? Has anybody ever come up and said, before these people are allowed into the school, I want to see the police checks and make sure that they are legally allowed to be into the school in the same way that the teachers are allowed to be in the school as well?
That's a great question. And I have no idea. And I mean, we can broaden that to anyone who comes in for any reason,
Hmm.
right? And because that is part of the contract, is that
Yeah,
you have to be a vetted member to have contact with children. It's the purpose of the policy code of conduct.
yeah.
And again, like it's so crazy what we're willing, it's so crazy what we're willing to allow our children to endure,
Yeah,
knowing that we were once children and how certain things have affected us and what we will turn a blind eye to. Because like you're speaking about children and it's just making me think of the different spaces that I've worked in. And I've worked in law firms, financial firms, insurance companies. So I've seen this at very high levels, how this contracting practice works. But I mean, there was a lawyer that I worked with, lovely lady, had young children, but her primary client was the archdiocese, and the majority of her work were sex abuse claims. And I'm like, how do you reconcile that? How
yeah.
do you do that for money and go home and look at your kids?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that? Right? These are the moral this is what's really getting squeezed out right now, is like these morality questions
Oh, yeah.
of how we're going to look at ourselves in the mirror going forward, and say, yes, I did the best I could.
Yeah, definitely. Now you have been a regular caller and you've been vocal on a lot of local radio stations, and given the opportunity, you always try and speak to get the message across. But are you finding pushback when you're trying to speak publicly about this? Are you being limited on the amount of time you're given to speak, or are they trying to cut you off and talk over you when you're trying to say what needs to be said?
Depends who I'm speaking to. So I primarily call into here, it's 95.7. It's our talk radio, and they always have an open hour every day. And some of them have been wonderful, and they give me the upper end and they don't interrupt me at all. They'll let me go the full 6, 7 minutes. But
Yeah,
seven's a little generous. 5 to 7 minutes, I can get that in.
yeah,
And that's incredible. And it's allowing other people just to kind of have those little Easter eggs that they can find. And it depends on what I'm talking about. The first time I spoke about Oyster Pond, I referenced sexual harassment and I could hear people clutch their pearls. And there was a disclaimer as soon as I finished saying, well, we haven't looked into this. And so the second time I called back, I read the definition and then there was no question. And I
wow.
was speaking about exactly how deceptively this feedback form has been pushed out basically to say, well, we engaged the public for their participation in their comment, and no one said there was anything wrong with it. We didn't disclose anything, but there's nothing wrong with it. You guys said it's okay, right? That's kind of how this works. It's that gaslighting and manipulation. In my most recent call, I like to talk a lot about how the government's a corporation, and I do that to try and get people to kind of take their mind out of the legislature and really keep it on business. Like this is all about business. And I did get a little bit of pushback recently from Steve Murphy, who is a bit of a journalistic, I don't want to call him an icon, but I guess that's the only word I have for Atlantic
Yeah,
Canada.
yeah. I
He's very
mean,
well known, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
he's
I
been in
mean,
that political
I
sphere.
yeah, I know Steve as well. Maybe I could send it to a mutual friend of ours, and maybe we could put this interview in the hands of Steve. I'm sure he won't comment on it, but I'd still like him to see what we're discussing today. He's familiar with the work that we've done at the Atlantic Underground for many years now.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe we'll just fire this one across and see what he says. Now, I was made aware of what I consider to be inappropriate books being given to young children in schools. And it's not just in Canada, this appears to be in the US, England, everywhere. And it's become, as I say, when I made my opening statement today, this is a lockstep process globally. So it certainly is an agenda that's being pushed forward everywhere. Have you been made aware of any of these books being removed since it was highlighted that these inappropriate books were being given to children? Or are these still in existence for children to read within the schools?
I have no idea.
Yeah,
I'm going to say based on the policies that we're looking at, I'd be surprised if they were removed.
yeah,
Just because of the reaction that administrators are having when it comes to this particular policy. They're literally saying that they are bound to administrate these policies.
yeah.
So how that filters into the books, especially if it's part of the curriculum, I really can't comment on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're still there.
Yeah, there was a case up in Chilliwack where the parents actually did push an investigation, and the RCMP came in and to have a look at the books and the material in Chilliwack, and they dismissed it and said everything was fine. Now, the way I look at it, and probably the very way that you look at the establishment as well, that this was probably pointless because the police and the schools themselves are all employed by the very same government pushing these agendas forward. So
Absolutely.
it's like in-house sweeping things under the carpet. Do you think there's a way to challenge that and stop this happening?
Well, part of the minister's responsibility has to do with the book exchange, has to do with the books that are in there. So again, I would put this back on the minister, and again look at the policy code of conducts and the curriculum and the Education Act, and you they're incompatible. Everything is incompatible, and you can't have one without the other. And she is duty bound by their oath to uphold this because again, principal to agent, agent to principal, you start to render the corporation in danger, right? So if we think of this is what I was talking about the other day with Steve Murphy. It's like if we think about the government as like a trust relationship where
Yeah,
you have the executive council as the trustee, or sorry, as the executor, the MLAs as the trustee. Well, the province of Nova Scotia is the beneficiary of that. The people aren't, right? Everything has to be done in benefit of the corporation, but they have to make sure that they're not doing something that can render that corporation in jeopardy, which it would be if there's no indemnification because the insurance companies won't insure it, right? Everything we do, our entire society is built on a subrogation model, which is that there's always going to be a third party that's responsible for you. No, we have to get back into this personal accountability and personal responsibility. Because the
Yeah.
moment you step into that, the moment you step into radical personal responsibility and self accountability, you don't need those guardrails of this indemnification from a third party that may or may not cover you because you don't understand all the terms and conditions.
Mhm.
So my spidey senses and my intuition tells me, go back to the contract, look at your Education Act, find that primary contract, and
Yeah.
start chipping away at the insurability. So in the US, you probably saw this during the pandemic. In the US, they had like this bond situation that it was called like run the bond or something like that. And parents were figuring out how to hit the bonds of the school trustees and the school boards down there who were trying to perpetrate things on kids because the essentially what was happening was the teachers, the administrators, the school board trustees, they're responsible for securing their own bond in order to hold those positions. Your bond gets hit like 3 times, you become unbondable,
Yeah.
right? So how does that work from an insurance perspective? We don't have I went down a deep rabbit hole here. We don't have the same bonding um, protocols here. We have insurance, and every school administrator is required to hold, I think it's like $5 million liability insurance on the school. So how do you start finding those insurance policies? Where are we looking for them? How do we write the letters of demand that have to go to the schools and go directly to the insurance companies? Because if you write a letter of demand indicating a claim and harm, and it goes to the company, and we're going to call the schools companies because that's what they are. It goes to the company that perpetrated the harm. If they don't forward it onto their insurer, they've nullified their policy. If they do put it over to their insurer, they may have still nullified their policy or at least not be covered for their actions. So that's why platforms like this are so important. So it's like anyone who's in the insurance industry, like fill in the blanks. Like let's come together and take all of our working knowledge that we've been accumulating through our life experience and through our work experience, and let's start to make sense of it. Let's pull it together. Let's start pulling at these threads and actually weave a bigger picture of what we're looking at so that we can actually come to an equitable solution
Yeah.
that not only works but keeps people safe in the process.
And the problem with Canada as well, this isn't just at the level of the schools. Unfortunately, this goes right up the ladder to being something which is massively promoted even by the Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, Justin Trudeau is clearly a disturbed character, and I'm sure this stems from having a drug addicted and promiscuous mother that suffered from severe mental trauma and a father that was either a dictator of Cuba or a dick head of Canada's government. Is this push for the LGBTQ, or as I so often call it, 50 Shades of Gay, beyond reasonable in today's society? And certainly, something that should not come from the head of government and have people with young, impressionable minds in schools looking up to a leader of a country pushing this agenda. I mean, do you think the anger and possibly the call for the removal of this gentleman within Canada? I mean, there's many, many reasons why he should be removed, but do you think that probably one of the biggest causes to have him removed from that position in Canada is to maybe ease the situation in what's going on with the infiltration of schools and literally targeting the children? Or is this possibly a deliberate technique to bring about the agenda and the mindset of children moving forward? Are they deliberately educating the future generations to fit in with the very plans of the agenda that they want to push forward?
That's such a big question. Um, and this is where it's like I kind of vacillate between a few thoughts.
Yeah,
So the agenda, say there's an agenda, it's there whether Trudeau's in power or not, right? He's just a figurehead. He's sitting at the front. The Privy Council is where we need to be concerned. Again, just like the Executive Council in Nova Scotia is making all the decisions, the Privy Council that sits behind everything at the federal level. That's regardless of who gets voted in, or regardless of who the public figurehead is. There's mainstays in those spaces that are just there all the time. Now, in terms of these social engineering agendas that were being shown, this is where you can't be fooled if you understand language. So I'm such a word nerd, and I don't assume the definition of anything. And if you go look up equity, I promise you there's nothing equitable about all of these agendas that splice people into so many different factions, that you're now fighting for uh, an identity instead of just being a human being, right? That's where we really have to get back to this, is that at the end of the day, every single thing that we see that's divided, that's designed to divide us, can only happen to the degree in which we can be divided inside as well,
yeah,
right? We really have to start taking responsibility over how we receive this information, and then how we translate it back into the world.
yeah.
And with these groups and these, there's so much division inside of that as well. Like you mentioned, like the LGBT community, that's completely fractured and divided,
It's been
right?
hijacked.
Because
Yeah, I think
it's
it's been
fully,
hijacked, and unfortunately, they are a very
absolutely
victim of this agenda, and they don't realize either.
right. Absolutely. And again, so look at your capacity. This is like, do you know who you are? Are you a victim? Because if you're going to be a victim, you're going to participate in your life like you're a victim. Are
Yeah,
you a leader? If you're a leader, you're going to participate in your life like a leader. But you can't lead anyone or anything until you know how to lead yourself first. And you can't lead yourself if you're not willing to be radically honest about who you are, accept how you got here, start to build in the resilience that you need to have the fortitude and the loyalty to your core values and your beliefs, that you even begin to trust yourself, that you're worthy of leading yourself. And I think the more that we can start to do that at an individual level, one, it's contagious as hell. People around you will start picking up on it because it feels different, it feels true, it feels authentic.
yeah,
And people want that. They want to feel that true sense of power, not authority, but power. And can you begin to emanate that from the inside out? And when we take that on personally and become incredibly accountable to ourselves for that, a lot of these agendas, you'll just look at them and be like, oh, that's cute. That's cute. I see what you're doing over here, but I'm going to move this way instead.
yeah,
And that's kind of where I've come over the last 5 years in terms of, okay, I see what you're saying, and I understand what you're trying to do, but this is what the paper says, and this is what I'm going to look at. Kind of like Judge Judy, show me. If you can't show me, it doesn't exist. So I have to look at the paper.
yeah. And that's it. I mean, what we're seeing is very reminiscent of the end days of a falling Roman Empire, where anything seemed to go. And it was the destruction of that very society, and probably one of the main things that did destroy that society. And what we're seeing in this day and age now, again, is it's opened the floodgates to anything goes. And if I want to publicly display it and you don't like it, you're the wrong, you're in the wrong, you're the bad person for stopping me. And as I said earlier, people want to do anything behind closed door, have at it, not a problem. But when it's forced upon everybody else to accept that this is normal, when it's from far beyond normal, it does bother me. I mean, what do you make of all these diverse orientations we're seeing, like people identifying as cats and requiring litter boxes to shit in public workspaces and things like that? I mean, I thought that the line in the sand would have been drawn a long time ago, but the fact that it's gained such media propaganda to allow it to happen, and the backing of governments and the backing of those who are all part of the very agendas that we're talking about. I thought there would have been more pushback on it, but do you think because it's coming from such higher authorities that people are made to feel that they are wrong for challenging this? And how do we change that perception in society to allow people to literally, as we've said before, swing that moral compass back and put things back on track again?
Mhm.
Because it's not going to get any better if it's not stopped. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the biggest, and this is where media, social media, algorithms, this is where everything becomes incredibly problematic, is that you see someone do something that is so socially like, what are they doing? Like you're saying, like the litter boxes and these really
Yeah.
radical ideas. You see that happening. And then the only thing you ever see is radical opposition to it that either becomes violent or the stakes become really high, right? So you hear about people getting canceled, getting stalked outside of their home, things happening. We always hear about the dangers of speaking out. My question is that true? Because again, going back to the pandemic, everybody said, you know, you have to wear a mask, you have to be vaccinated, you have to do this, you have to do that. I didn't do any of that. And nor was I, for the most part, attacked. Like we would see people on social media that weren't wearing a mask and they were getting attacked by people in public spaces. That was never my experience. I know it was your experience. That was never my, it happened once very early on where I was stalked by a group of men through a store. Um, but that really wasn't my experience because I was just learning how to navigate it a little differently.
Yeah.
That's where it becomes incumbent on each person to go, I see what you're telling me to do. I understand what you say is going to happen. Is it true? And that's what we have to start figuring out at an individual level, not waiting for someone else to do something and then see what their result is and whether or not it's true. Because I could go into a store and say the exact same thing that someone else could, and they'd
Yeah.
have an issue and I wouldn't. There's like this energetic thing that underpins everything in the the way we show up in a space actually determines how someone's going to react to us, but we'll never know what's true or not until we do it for ourselves. As far as I'm concerned, everything I see is a hypothesis until I prove it for myself. So that's why I'm like, I've been writing letters since I was a kid. So I've had this in me for a long time, but I'm like, no, like this doesn't make sense to me. Like you need to now, you're not a final authority. If I'm asking you a question, you can respond. And more times than not, they do. And if they don't respond, then you use the mechanisms like the Office of the Ombudsman and you compel a response
Yeah.
because it's a business, right? So if we get out of the idea of government illusion, no, business only. And I'm a business dealing with a business. So we're going to have this conversation like that.
Yeah.
Um, it cuts through everything that you're saying. So yes, then the other side of the coin is how do we start to discharge those emotions from our body? And how do we learn how to become so self regulated that when the earth is trying to shake us and rattle us, that we can be like, nope, I'm going to come right back into center. I'm going to get flared up, but I'm going to come back into center and be able to look at this objectively and just look at the black on white and strictly with their words, use their words all the time. And I've said for a long time without really understanding what it meant, like you can use the system to break the system.
Yeah.
Everything that they have there is designed to actually get pulled into equity because it would actually be a violation of their oaths for it to not be that way. It's just really complicated until it's not.
Yeah.
It's really complicated until it's not.
Use their own system against them, and that's people stand in their own power when they do that. I was trying to find something then I did actually see from Nova Scotia
Mm-hmm.
uh, yesterday that seemed to be on social media. Was it St Andrew's Church? um, there was a big sign outside one of the churches in Nova Scotia, and I kind of considered that it was mocking the efforts of the war veterans in the area because it was a transgender remembrance service, supposedly for those who had been attacked and injured for their beliefs as transgender. And this there was quite a stir yesterday over social media because of this sign that was outside the church wanting to do this. Um, I'm absolutely amazed. I mean, has this been the stepping stone from the allowance of the church when they eventually recognized and allowed gay marriages, which was probably a big surprise to many people that follow religion. But to get to the point now where they're having transgender Remembrance Day services, um, to me, it seems to mock not only the military that have served and died for their country in war, to try and make it look as if it's at the same level seem to be very hypocritical. But at the end of the day, I really kind of thought about this. And I was trying to remember how many news articles and how many times I was aware of transgender people being attacked or killed in Nova Scotia. And quite frankly, I couldn't remember one. Are you aware of anything that's happened there? And would it justify having such a remembrance service at a church for them? And what's your thoughts on this as well?
I'm not familiar with that story. So, I mean, full disclosure, I don't have I haven't been on social media in 5 years.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that don't hit my radar, and I don't read a lot of the propaganda that comes my way. And I think that keeps me in a little bit of a bubble, but it allows me to kind of go find what I need when I need to.
Yeah.
Um, I think what you're alluding to is a perfect example of how these DEI policies, these inclusivity policies, do nothing but serve to separate and divide people.
Yeah.
There's no reason for that. I'm pretty sure that when you're on a battlefield and there's a gun pointed at you, as long as the person next to you has a gun, you're gonna be okay with what's like. There's no division of who's standing next to you on that front line at that point. You're in that together. So then why are we now going to remember you separately? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And
No.
I think I think that's what a lot of people struggle with. It's are we the human? Are we, as what Martin Luther King said, judge me by the content of my character? Like, we're so well past that, right? Like, those are beautiful platitudes, but no one actually means it. They try and bake it into everything, but just the idea of an inclusive policy like that, and with the church, I think it's a perfect example of policy policy going against contract. Because if people always go back to the Bible and they like to use the Bible as a reference, well, the
Yeah.
policy of the church seemed to be incompatible with the Bible to a certain extent, right? It's or maybe it's not. I don't know, but it appears to
Oh,
be.
I mean, think of the legal process. What's the first thing they ask you to put your hand on and swear to when you stood in the dock in court?
Well, it's because the Bible is the original law. It's the law manual.
Mhm.
All laws come through and run concurrently with the laws of the Holy See, right? So we're
Yeah.
getting into ultimate contract at that point from
Yeah.
a lex mercatoria stamp. That's a whole other conversation. Getting into the lex mercatoria and getting into the merchant law and the contracts that we have to abide by.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's like, and this is where it's like participation. So do we continue to keep our focus on all of the ways that we're being divided and fueling that? Or can we kind of bring it back into center and go, that's cute. I hear what you're trying to do, but I'm just not going to participate. And participate means with time, energy, and attention.
Yeah.
I'm not going to put any effort into that. What actually starts to happen when we change that participation model? Um, and really bring it all the way back into self, right? And that's really hard because we've been taught not to be selfish. So maybe we need to be very selfish right now and take care of the individual first.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's selfish. I mean, when we consider the power of law, now let's say let's say somebody wanted to get me psychologically evaluated and locked into an asylum for my own protection or for the protection of others. Clearly, that is a principle of law that would need to be brought into place to be able to do that. Um, I mean, does society need to reset its moral compass? And do we need to treat many of these, what I consider to be disorders, in the correct manner? Because they're clearly defined in psychology's diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. Um, would, if people looked into the legality side of these things, these are, they're listed in this manual of mental disorders. Why wouldn't people turn around and, let's say somebody is a drag queen or transgender and wants to dress up or whatever it is, this is termed as a mental disorder within the psychology manuals. Surely it could be challenged on a legal basis where if somebody wants to send one of these people into the school, that the parents could turn around and say, no, this is clearly defined in this book, which is legal and can be used for legal purposes. Because let's say it went to court and it was challenged. If you stood there in front of a judge and you brought a psychologist in or a mental health expert and they said, yes, clearly what this person is going through is page whatever defined as this, and yes, we do class it as a mental disorder. Surely it would stop people going into the schools under this category of mental disorders should it be challenged. And once case law is put into place, and once one case has been tried and this has been clearly outlined and ruled in favor of the very people bringing it to court, surely that case law could then be used for every school wishing to bring transgender, drag queens, anybody of any strange sexual orientation in and being put in front of children. Is that a possibility moving forward?
I mean, this is where it gets interesting, and we have to look at the system as a whole and go, would a judge ever rule on one? Our court system is based on assumption and presumption. We kind of fall under Roman civil law. So we like to think that we have like this codified law that we can point at, but we don't. Everything is precedent based, right?
Yeah.
And I know that you've talked about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and there's even some ambiguity around the legitimacy and the validity of the charter based on Section 58 of the Constitution. Like
Mhm.
there's some sections there that are like, ooh, I don't even know if we can point to that. Again, it's just, do we have the illusion of a charter because we have enough precedent and case law to support outcomes, or like why can't I just go in and point to the charter and actually have a valid
Yeah.
argument like they do in the US, right? So when we're looking at the legal system and you're taking on something like the Department of Education around what they're doing um, in these spaces, is the Attorney General even going to bring something like that into the courts? Because they may have to participate in one way, shape, or form when there's like self incrimination involved, right? The system has to self incriminate inside of a courthouse. And
Yeah.
I don't know if they will. And that's what we saw happen through the pandemic,
Mhm.
right? Judges were throwing things out left, right, and center. They weren't touching it. They knew they weren't touching it. But there was like this thing of self-incrimination. So I mean, if you want to go to the expense of pulling something like this through the court system, and really beefing up a fiery debate, could someone do that? Perhaps.
Yeah.
Is it as effective as trying to maybe move it through administrative processes? I don't know.
Yeah.
I really don't know the answer to that. But I do know that we the way we think everything is going to work doesn't usually work that way. And the DSM is being challenged around those specific inclusivity policies. And then we're getting into like this diagnosis psychosis that brought us into COVID as well.
Yeah.
So again, it's the participant. How do we want to participate, and how do we really want to focus our attention on something like this? Um, I also know that everyone's here to fulfill a certain role, and maybe this topic needs to be tackled from a million different ways in order to actually move something through. It's not maybe do this or this, it's and.
Yeah, that's it. And parents need to wake up. They need to realize now that they are there to protect the children. I think too many people in the world around us have given away the power to authorities and think that those authorities are going to protect the children. And quite clearly, this is not the case. This
Yeah,
is why we're having this discussion today. It's brought
yeah,
us to a point in time where it's clearly evident that the educational system is not acting in the best interests of the children or the parents.
yeah.
And I do believe that it's a time that we need to see change, and we need to see people standing in the power and pushing back against the very establishment that is going to form what I see being not a very bright future for the very people out there. Um, is there anything today that is pressing that you wanted to mention before we wrap up here?
Um, what I would really encourage and like to encourage parents to do, whether you're in Nova Scotia or any other province, go to your Education Act. Look at what the provisions are in terms of policies that have to be mandated. Look at anything that might be considered unacceptable behavior. Like that's a powerful topic to go dig into, and look at your policy code of conduct and
Mm.
see if the two align, see if there's any issues. And then if I'm a parent, can I reach out to school administrators? Is there a school board that I can reach out to? If there's an issue that is coming up in your school that appears to you to violate either that policy code of conduct or the Education Act, or if you're seeing that these policies are incompatible, stick to the contract, regardless of what the issue is, right? In the case of Oyster Pond, it happened to be around gender identity, which is a really polarizing topic. If you can
Yeah,
have the conversation without even bringing those words up, you are miles ahead of anyone else. Because again, it's still like it's a construct, but
yeah,
this now we're getting into laws and contracts. So if you can pull social constructs out of the laws and contracts, it's going to start to become very clear. So in Nova Scotia, call to action, like you need to reach out to HRCE, you need to reach out to the Department of Education and ask them what are they doing with the policy code of conduct? Why does the first draft state that the current draft does not apply to adults that come into contact with children? That's a blatant lie. And why have they removed sexual harassment and sexual abuse from the list of definitions? Put it on your social media, put it in email, talk about it on your local radio stations. Put this question front and center. We have a new government that just came in. The guy who knocked on my door, who won his riding, is the current supervisor of schools for the province. And claims he did not know that those definitions had been removed or that that had been circulated because it happened while he was on leave.
no
Right.
excuse.
So it's cute. So, it's have these conversations, have them, and don't be shy, because again, you're not talking about an ideology or a belief. You're somewhat protected if you're just saying, why are you removing this? And everyone should be concerned when we're talking about children and we're removing sexual abuse and sexual harassment from conversation.
Yeah.
What's the end goal? Yeah.
Now, should anybody wish to maybe contact you for some advice, or
Mm.
wish to share some information with you that may be further compelling to what we're already aware of, is there a good way that anybody can reach out to you?
Sure. The best way to find me would be through Substack. That's kind of my communication portal and email list. So it's nicoleconnor.substack.com. And if you sign up there and jump into the subscriber list, I do post publicly, but I also send a lot of private emails through there as well. And I'm happy to facilitate these conversations. So where you were talking about earlier, parents coming together and just having informal conversations, I'm happy to facilitate those conversations
Yeah.
and get the ball rolling. I'm not going to hold your hand and give you a template, because we do have to learn how to find the courage and strength within ourselves to kind of stand there. But I will give you as much support and guidance, as I can to move through this process.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
And as we always say here on the Atlantic Underground podcast, believe nothing and question everything. It's
Yes.
been really good. I think a lot of people are going to get probably empowered by watching this conversation and what we've discussed today. And it will certainly open up the expansion of thought around this situation, which is a good thing, in my opinion. Um, so anybody out there that's watching this, if you share this, if you get this out there, let other people hear it and see it. So, put it in the hands of people, even allow teachers, school boards, whatever, to see this conversation and maybe just ask what they think and hear their comments about that. So, thank you again for coming on, Nicole. This has been a really interesting conversation. And let's see where this takes things. And we look forward to seeing some movement that will happen to protect the innocent children, certainly in Nova Scotia, but right across Canada and in other parts of the world again that are unfortunately under the blankets of this agenda right now. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you for be willing to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
It was needed, very, very much needed. Take care, and thank you again. Bye now.
Thank you.